Yates O'Conor was a man used to reading signs. He could read a change in the weather by the shape of the clouds, and he knew the mood of his herd by its silence. That afternoon, when the train whistle echoed from the east, it wasn't just the sound of steel, but something like a weary cry. The train usually brought mail, machine parts, and new faces seeking their fortune. But today, Yates had a gut feeling it was carrying something else. A burden. He didn't know what it was, only that trouble was coming to Red Rock, and it wore the shape of a person. In the Montana Territory of 1883, the wind was a merciless thing, scouring the high valley with grit and the ghost of a winter that refused to die. It was this wind that seemed to push the woman from the train car, afraid of sorrows delivered, to the desolate platform of Red Rock. She did not so much walk as spill from the steps, a tangle of torn calico and exhaustion. Her face was a testament to some recent, brutal history, one cheekbone blooming with a dark bruise, her bottom lip cracked and bloodied. Her boots, worn through at the sole, looked as though they had walked 100 miles farther than the train had carried them. But it was the fine, uncontrollable tremor in her hands that clutched at nothing, that gave men pause. She had the look of a hunted creature that had finally run out of ground. The station master took an involuntary step back, his mouth half open to ask a question he already knew she couldn't answer. Her eyes, one nearly swollen shut, stared blankly at the weathered planks beneath her feet. Then, as if a final invisible thread holding her upright had snapped, her knees gave way. Yates O'Conor, leaning against a post of the stockyard fence while waiting on a wire shipment, had been watching. The train hissed to a stop. He saw what the others missed. The moment the woman's last reserve of strength simply evaporated. Before her body could fully meet the unforgiving timber of the platform, he was moving. He crossed the distance in 3 powerful strides, sinking to one knee beside her fragile form. With an ease that belied her dead weight, he gathered her into his arms, one hand supporting her head as it slumped against the solid wall of his chest. He could feel the fevered heat of her skin through her thin dress and smell the stale scent of fear and travel. She was lighter than a bale of hay, a sparrow caught in a dust storm. Her breath was a shallow whisper against his shirt. She was alive. That was all that mattered. His voice, when he spoke to the stunned station master, was low and edged with steel. The doctor, where? 4 miles out of town, the Keller place. Yates didn't wait for an argument. There would be none. He carried her toward his buckskin mare, a steady, reliable animal that barely shifted at the addition of its new burden. He settled her in the saddle before him, her slight frame nestled against his chest, and spurred his horse toward town, a fragile figure against the vast and different landscape. He didn't know her name or her story, but he recognized the wreckage of a battle hard fought, and he was not the kind of man to leave a soldier fallen on the field. The ride to town was a blur of dust and the steady rhythm of the mare's gait. Calla drifted in and out of a painful haze, aware only of the solid warmth at her back and the secure arm that held her. Once, when his hold shifted, a raw sound of fear escaped her lips, and a voice, low and calm, answered it. "Easy now, you're safe." The words were a balm, and she sank back into the darkness. Doc Keller was a man who'd seen the worst of what the frontier could do to a body, from gunshot wounds to cattle tramplings. He took one look at the woman Yates carried through his door and simply gestured toward a clean cot. "Lay her down. I'll get the laudanum." Yates laid her gently on the cot, his touch surprisingly deft as he brushed a strand of dirt-caked hair from her bruised cheek. He then retreated to the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set like granite. He did not leave. He spent the night in a hard-backed chair by the cot, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an instinct, the same instinct that made him pull a newborn calf from a bog or face down a cornered wolf. You didn't abandon a creature in distress. Hours later, the doctor wiped his hands on a rag. She mend, he said, his voice weary. Physically, at least. But the story those bruises tell, that's a different matter. He looked at Yates. What happened to her? Yates's gaze remained on the sleeping woman. That's a story she'll have to tell herself. Calla woke to the unfamiliar slant of morning light through a clean window. For a moment, there was only peace. Then came the awareness, the clean scent of lye soap, the soft mattress beneath her, and the dark, still shape of a man sitting in a chair nearby. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Her mind, a cornered animal, immediately began charting distances to the door, to the window. He must have sensed her terror. He didn't rise, didn't make any sudden moves. He simply lifted a tin cup from the floor beside him. "Morning," he said, his voice even. "You fainted at the station. I brought you here." He added after a beat, "I'm not going to hurt you." Her eyes, sharp and calculating, darted from his face to the exits and back again. He gave her his name, Yates O'Conor, and told her he ran a cattle outfit west of town. She offered nothing in return. When he asked if she had a name, she only stared at her own battered hands. The days that followed unfolded in a quiet rhythm. Calla spoke little, but she began to sip the broth Yates brought her each morning. He never stayed long. He would set the bowl down, inquire quietly how she was feeling, and then sit with her while she ate, his presence as silent and steady as the mountains that framed the valley. He never pushed, never pried. He simply showed up. It happened on the fifth day. The color had begun to return to her face, and the swelling around her eye had receded. She was staring out the window when she spoke, her voice a dry rasp, as if torn from a place deep inside her. "I had children." Yates sat perfectly still, not wanting to spook the trust that had taken days to surface. "Willer and Weston," she continued, her eyes glassy with memory. 5 and 7. He took them from me. She finally turned her gaze from the window to him. "My husband, he used his fists to make me ugly, then used his money and his friends to tell the court I was mad, unfit." Her voice cracked. "On the last word, I tried to run with them. He found us. I don't even know where they are now." Yates felt a cold fury tighten in his gut. His hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. He kept his voice level. "Did you go to the law?" She gave a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "The law believes men with money, not women with bruises." He looked at her, then at the profound loneliness in her gaze, and saw not a victim, but a survivor who had fought to the very edge of her world. "You're not alone in it now, Calla," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Not anymore." A long silence stretched between them in the small clinic room, filled with the weight of her story. Finally, Calla looked past him, toward the open door and the slice of the world beyond it. "I'm tired of hiding," she said, more to herself than to him. Yates didn't offer empty platitudes or easy promises. His answer was simple. "Then don't." He found her a place. It wasn't much, a small room above the feed store with a narrow bed and a single window that overlooked the dusty main street, but it was hers. She paid her board by sweeping the storefront and helping unload sacks of grain, the simple, rhythmic work a balm for a mind that had been in turmoil for too long. Yates became a regular feature of her evenings. He would appear as the sun began to bleed color across the western peaks, sometimes with a few apples from his mother's orchard, other times with a worn book he thought she might like. He never made a fuss, never overstayed his welcome. One evening, he tripped over a stray calico cat in the alley, stumbling with a gracelessness that was at odds with his usual steady presence. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard the sound from her, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, unburdened laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "You're not as formidable as you look, Mr. O'Conor," she'd told him, a small grin touching her lips. "And you're stronger than you think." "Mrs. Zane," he'd shot back, his own eyes crinkling at the corners. Their bond was forged in these quiet moments. As dusk settled one evening, they stood together on the small landing outside her room. The air was thick with the scent of hay and distant wood smoke. "Why do you keep coming here, Yates?" she asked, her voice low. He leaned against the porch rail, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Because I want to." She looked down at her hands, at the faint, fading map of bruises. "You don't know anything about me." He reached out then, his calloused fingers gently covering hers. Where they rested on the rail. She flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, but she did not pull away. And in that shared stillness, something shifted between them. It was a silent understanding that needed no further words. A week later, he brought her an idea. "Miss Cartwright." "At the schoolhouse," he said. "She mentioned needing a hand with the little ones. Someone patient." "I don't know anything about teaching," Calla protested immediately. "You know how to listen," he countered. "That's more than most." She started the following Monday. The children were wary at first, their curiosity masked by shyness. But Calla had a quiet way about her. She would kneel to their level and simply wait, never pushing, never demanding. By the end of the week, one of the little girls, shy and freckle-faced, left a small hand-braided blue ribbon on her chair. That evening, as she and Yates shelled peas on the steps of the livery, she mentioned it. "Willa had ribbons just like it," she said softly, her fingers pausing over a pod. "I used to braid her hair with them." Yates didn't speak, just listened. The silence settled between them, comfortable now, not empty. Calla cracked another pod, the small green peas tumbling into the bowl. Her voice was steady when she spoke again. "I sent a letter," she said, not looking at him, "to the court in Kansas City. I used a different name. I don't know if they'll answer." He didn't ask why or what she hoped for. He just pushed. Another handful of pods toward her, his presence a silent, unwavering promise that she was no longer facing the world alone. One evening, as the first stars began to pierce the deep indigo sky, Yates watched Calla staring into the distance, her hands still. "What would you do?" he asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "If you got them back?" She didn't look at him, but her gaze seemed to focus on a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "I'd find a place with trees," she said softly. "Something near water, nothing grand. Just somewhere they could run and not be afraid." Yates let the image settle between them. "I know a place like that," he said after a long moment. "It's got an old barn and a stream that runs behind it. Been sitting quiet for a spell." He was planting a seed, a possibility of a future she could not yet see for herself. The future arrived sooner than expected, in a thin envelope from the county clerk. It wasn't a decision, but a summons. Her petition to reopen the case required her to appear in person. Calla read the letter twice, her face pale but her expression resolved. "I'll need to go to Kansas City," she said that evening, her voice even. "I'll need someone to ride with me." He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved over her, taking in the newfound strength in her shoulders, the steadiness in her hands. He saw the fight in her and the fear she refused to show. "Then I'll come," he said, as if it were the only logical answer in the world. Evening before they left, she followed him to the cool, hay-scented air of the stables. His mare was already saddled. Beside her stood a smaller, handsome roan gelding, its coat brushed to a soft gleam. Folded neatly on a nearby tack bench was a sturdy riding skirt and a warm coat. "That's not mine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is now," Yates replied, not turning from his task of checking the cinch on his own saddle. "Figured you'd want to ride your own horse back." Her throat was too thick to speak. She simply stood there for a long while, one hand resting on the roan's withers, feeling the solid, living warmth beneath her palm. They rode east at first light, their shadows stretching long and thin behind them. The rolling hills of Montana flattened into an endless expanse of brittle grass and scattered, wind-worn cottonwoods. Dust became a second skin, a constant grit in their teeth. They spoke little, their partnership measured not in words, but in the shared rhythm of their journey, in the way he'd slow his pace when he saw her shift from weariness in the saddle, and the way she'd have a fire going by the time he'd tended to the horses. On the third night, camped in the shelter of a dry ravine, she looked across the low fire at him. "I thought I'd feel more afraid, coming back to this part of the country," she said, pulling apart a piece of hardtack. He glanced up, waiting. "I don't," she finished. "Because I'm not alone this time." Yates didn't answer, just watched the flames dance. The admission hung in the air, as real and warm as the fire itself. She watched him for a moment, then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small folded piece of cloth. She passed it across the fire to him. He unfolded it carefully. Inside lay a single faded ribbon, once pink, now weathered to the pale color of bone. "Willow wore that the day he took them," she said, her voice catching for the first time. "It fell in the wagon. I didn't know I still had it until weeks later." Yates held the fragile ribbon in his large, calloused palm, as if it were something sacred. He looked at it for a long moment before folding the cloth back over it, slow and deliberate, and handing it back to her. "You'll put it in her hair again," he said. It wasn't a question or a hope. It was a statement of fact. She tucked it away and lay back on her bedroll, her eyes open to the immense, star-filled silence of the prairie sky. Kansas City rose from the flatlands like a bruise on the horizon. To Calla, it was not a place of opportunity, but a cage of memory. Every clang of a rail car, every shout from a wagon driver, was a ghost of a past she had fought to escape. She kept her hat pulled low, but her shoulders were squared as she walked beside Yates. She was no longer running from the city. She was here to reclaim what it had stolen. The boarding house they found was a modest 2-story building with tired lace curtains and a landlady whose eyes held a merciful lack of curiosity. Once in there, room a simple space with 2 cots and a basin. Calla went to the window. 4 blocks away, the stone facade of the courthouse stood impassive and solid against the sky. She turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "Tomorrow, I have to do this part myself." Yates was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He simply nodded. "I'll be on the steps." She paused, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "You're not going to argue?" "Wasn't my decision to make," he said. A short breath, almost a laugh, escaped her. It was strange to be granted. This much respect felt more strengthening than any word of encouragement could have been. The next morning, she walked toward the courthouse alone. Her back was straight. Her hands, once perpetually trembling, were still at her sides. Yates watched her climb the stone steps and disappear through the heavy oak doors. Then he took up his post, a quiet, unmovable sentinel in a world of noise and hurry. He waited. It was nearly noon when the doors opened again. She emerged, blinking against the harsh sunlight. She walked toward him, her steps measured, her face a careful, unreadable mask, until she was standing right before him. "They've agreed to reopen the petition," she said, her voice flat with emotional exhaustion. "But there are conditions." She held up a folded paper. "I have 1 month to prove I have a stable home, a source of income, a place for them." She took a breath. "And I'll need an affidavit from a person of good standing who can speak to my character." Her eyes met his, and the unspoken question hung between them. "Yates, this will tether your name to mine, officially, on paper." He didn't hesitate. "Some things are worth being tethered to, Calla." She pressed her lips together, a line of white against her pale skin, and gave a single sharp nod. They didn't speak again until their horses were saddled, and they stood at the edge of the rail yards, the city's grime behind them and the open promise of the West before them. The dust of the trail was a welcome perfume. I want them too. Grow up knowing what safety feels like, she said, her voice low and fierce. What it means to be loved without having to earn it, without cost. Yates looked from her determined face to the endless horizon. Then that's the life we'll build for them. The words settled between them. We. She swung into the saddle and pointed her horse west. She didn't look back, not because she was afraid of what lay behind her, but because for the first time, everything she was riding toward was right there beside her. They returned to Montana as August began to soften the edges of the land, the fierce summer heat giving way to long golden afternoons. The air no longer tasted of dust but of pine and curing grass. As they crested the familiar ridge overlooking the valley, Calla felt a loosening in her chest she hadn't realized was there. This felt less like a return and more like an arrival. Yates led her off the main track, following a faint path that wound through the cottonwoods toward the slow bend of a creek. There, nestled in a clearing, sat a small cabin. Its tin roof was dappled with rust, and the porch leaned slightly, but it stood strong against the wind, its windows like watchful eyes. A weathered barn stood sturdy behind it. Calla slowed her, roan to a stop, taking it all in. This is the place you spoke of. It is, Yates said. She looked from the cabin to him, a practical question forming on her lips. Are we buying it then? Or borrowing? He dismounted and stood before her, his gaze direct. It's yours, Calla. The deed was transferred. Last week, I put it in your name. She stared at him, the words failing to connect. Her own name, on a deed. The concept was so foreign, it had no place to land in her mind. Why? She finally managed to ask, her voice a whisper. Because a person needs their own ground to stand on, he said simply, as if explaining the weather. If they're going to build a life that lasts. She looked away from the intensity of his gaze toward the cabin that was somehow hers, and felt the weight of a generosity so profound it almost brought her to her knees. This time, however, her legs held firm. Their days fell into a rhythm of shared labor. Calla, with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, scraped and sanded the raw porch boards until they were smooth beneath her hands. Yates worked above her, replacing weathered shingles on the roof, the steady, rhythmic sound of his hammer a constant reassurance. They mended fences, cleared the overgrown path to the creek, and worked side by side in a silence born of shared purpose. The town, in its own quiet way, offered its blessing. Miss Cartwright sent over a small, sturdy stove on a wagon, and Doc Keller appeared one afternoon with a heavy quilt his sister had made, its colors as warm as the late summer sun. They were not handouts, but offerings, the slow, careful weaving of a lone woman back into the fabric of a community. Each evening, they sat on the newly sanded steps and watched the sky darken over the ridge. He would hand her a cup of hot, dark chicory, and her fingers would brush his in the exchange. They rarely spoke of the future or the past. They simply inhabited the present, the space between them filled with the comfortable weight of all they had been through together. A letter, bearing a Kansas City postmark, arrived with the circuit mail rider in the second week of September. Calla stood on the porch, the envelope in her hand, her thumb pressed against the wax seal. Yates paused on the ladder where he'd been fixing a shutter and watched her. He saw her take a slow, deep breath before sliding her finger under the flap. Her eyes scanned the page, her face a mask of concentration. He saw the hard line of her mouth soften, saw her shoulders, which had been tense with anticipation, finally relax. When she looked up at him, her eyes were clear and bright. Her voice was steady. The court has found in my favor. She paused, letting the words settle in the quiet air. A matron is bringing the children. They arrive on the train next week. Yates didn't ask if she was ready. He didn't need to. He only looked toward the road that led to town and said, "We'll ride to meet them." The Red Rock station platform was just as Calla remembered it, the same cracked wooden planks, the same scent of coal smoke and dust. But the woman standing on it was not the same. She stood tall beside Yates, her hands gloved and still at her sides, her gaze fixed on the approaching train. The sky above was a heavy, expectant gray, holding the promise of the season's first snow. The train hissed to a halt. Doors opened. Passengers disembarked. Calla's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic drum in the quiet air. Then, a thin woman in a plain bonnet stepped down, guiding two small figures before her. Calla's breath caught. They were smaller than she remembered. Willa's hair was shorter, cropped bluntly below her ears. Weston's face was thin and pale, his eyes wide and uncertain as he clung to the matron's skirt. For a paralyzing second, they were strangers. Then Willa's gaze lifted and locked with hers. A universe of loss and longing passed between them in an instant. Ma, the single word was all it took. The strength that had carried Calla across 1,000 miles of prairie, that had held her steady before a judge and jury, finally gave way. Her knees hit the wooden planks and her arms opened wide. Willa ran first, a choked sob breaking from her as she crashed into her mother's embrace. Weston followed a heartbeat later, his small body trembling as he burrowed into the circle. Of her arms, Calla held them, her own shoulders shaking. One hand tangled in Willa's hair, the other pressed to Weston's back. "I'm here," she whispered, the words a prayer, a promise, an anchor. I'm here now." Yates remained a step behind, a silent guardian of the sacred moment. He met the matron's tired gaze and gave a single respectful tip. Of his hat, he had brought a wagon. The ride home was quiet. Willa sat pressed against her mother's side, her head resting on Calla's arm, her eyes drinking in the landscape she didn't remember. Weston slept in Calla's lap, his small hand curled around a fold of her shawl. Yates drove the wagon, his presence a steady, protective shadow. That night, after showing her children the small room that was theirs, with the warm quilt on their bed and the moon framed in the window, Calla tucked them in with a hand that did not tremble. When she finally stepped out onto the porch, Yates was waiting, leaning against a post, his eyes on the stars that had begun to break through the clouds. She stopped before him. "I don't have the words for what you've done for me, Yates." He looked down at her, the lantern light carving gentle lines beside his mouth. "Then don't look for them, Calla. Just live it." "I want you to stay," she said, the words coming out clear and strong. He was still, and she took a step closer. "I don't just want the roof and the land. I want the man who brings broth to a stranger. I want the man who waits on the courthouse steps. I want you beside me when I wake." He reached out and brushed his thumb over her cheekbone, a touch that held all the tenderness they had never spoken. "I was hoping you'd say that." When he lowered his head to kiss her, it was without haste or fire. It was a kiss of quiet certainty, a promise of shared dawns and weathered seasons. It was the feeling of coming home. The first snow fell that night. The next morning, Calla stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around Willa as they watched the sun rise over a world blanketed in clean, quiet peace. Through the window, she could see Yates by the hearth, stirring the fire, with Weston half asleep in a small chair beside him. The cabin smelled of cedar, wood smoke, and fresh coffee. She looked out one last time at the land that was hers, at the life that was theirs. Then she turned, guided her daughter by the hand, and stepped inside, out of the cold and into the warmth.